Halloween. My favorite time of year. America has a lot of holidays, but there's two that stand out to me. October 31st.
I got a rock.
And December 31st. In high school, these were the holidays I spent with friends, doing dumb shit and staying up all night, gallivanting around neighborhoods, making deals for unwanted candy like a stock exchange, and coordinating group costumes. Even after I went to college, these are the parties that kick ass, and that family members don't ask you to stay home for. But there's so much more to love about Halloween. The coming of fall, the delightful shades of orange, purple, and black. Whether you like sweets and coziness, or horror and mayhem, it's got something for everyone. And yeah, commercialism bad, but there's magic to be had without buying stuff. One of my favorite Halloween traditions was to stay up late with my crusty iPad and pore through the tales of the Creepypasta Wiki. Amateur horror writers, creating a veritable library of tales to petrify, or at least laugh at. A good chunk of these were just corrupted children's media, and unfortunately, that trend hasn't died out yet. But I had my favorites, stories that kept me coming back, scratched that itch in my brain, or genuinely unnerved me. And as our first Halloween together, my dear viewers, I thought I'd celebrate the season by regaling you with tales of my favorite creepypastas. Now that I'm older, they might not be as chilling as they were 10 years ago, but I think there's something of value to be found in each of them. With that, let's begin. In the late 1940s, Russian scientists sealed prisoners of war in a room pumped full of gas stimulant. Their goal? Keep them awake for 30 days straight. They were given food, books, running water, and cots to sleep on, with a promise of freedom after the experiment was up. What could go wrong? The Russian sleep experiment, posted by Orange Soda to the Creepypasta Wiki, originated on the X board of 4chan, dedicated to the paranormal. No one knows who originally wrote it, but since it showed up in 2010, it's received a lot of acclaim. There's been movies, plays, books, and shows released over the last decade, either inspired by or directly adapting the original story. Given the story is formatted as a historical record rather than a personal account, some even believed it was real. I wasn't that gullible at the age of 12, but I did fall in love with the story. Some of the best horror is unexplained, letting your imagination run wild to fill in the blank spaces. If you hear that noise out in the woods, it's a lot less scary when you know what's causing it. Even if you find out it's a bear, there's at least ways to deal with bears. But without that confirmation, you have to be ready for anything. Staying awake slowly drives the prisoners insane. And towards the beginning, the story is more grounded in realism. The effects of not sleeping on the psyche are well documented, and I could see the first third of the story feasibly happening. While they still have their minds, the prisoners start regretting the events that brought them here, whispering and begging to be let out by betraying their comrades. All the while, the narration describes these events surgically and uncaring. It's just history to the author. But eventually, after their minds break entirely, something else emerges. They become eerily calm, acting with purpose, first covering the windows, and then resisting attempts to remove them from the room. It's unclear where the dividing line is between the men that entered and the things they became within. But when the researchers finally peer within the chamber, they find creatures no longer truly human. Skin stripped from flesh, bodies eviscerated, several inches of liquid viscera pooling on the floor, and yet impossibly still alive. They put up one hell of a fight, killing a few soldiers and screaming as they're removed from the presence of the gas. Whenever they finally fall asleep, no longer kept awake by the stimulant, they immediately succumb to their injuries. It's similar to stories of supernatural possession, but once again, there's at least rules that govern ghosts and demons. We don't know what these things are, how they came about, and how distinct they are from the people they originally were. A lot of attention is given to the medical anomalies, with the bodies still functioning, but long past the point they should have. I think it's this little touch that adds to the fear factor. It's not that they're zombies, dead but still moving. Their digestive system still works, their heart's still pumping blood, even while outside of their bodies. Their brain scans are normal, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as though they were repeatedly suffering brain death. Eventually, the commanding officer orders the researchers to be sealed from within for a closer look. Upon hearing this, they snap. The mental strain of running the experiment, of watching men turn into monsters, proves too much, and they mutiny, killing the prisoners out of both mercy and spite. But before finishing the job, the researcher screams, "What are you?" Have you forgotten so easily? We are the madness that lurks within you all. We are what you sedate into silence. And with that, the experiment ends. The story gives us the subtlest peek behind the curtain, but even then, it's hardly an answer. And the last of the prisoners dies before we can learn any more. Was that the same man that entered, just twisted into something unrecognizable? Or something else? Something that lives within all of us? We'll never know. Godzilla Monster of Monsters was a 1988 game for the Nintendo Entertainment System, where you play as the titular kaiju. You go around, smashing stuff and beating up other kaiju. I never played it myself, but I haven't heard great things about it. However, it's the focus of this next story, commonly just called Godzilla NES, posted from April 23rd to December 4th in 2011. It's got more effort than your average pasta. There's 8 chapters and an epilogue, as well as a ton of custom-drawn images. I've also been told that a lot of the monsters featured are deep cuts for an American Godzilla fan, so it's clear that the author loves the franchise. To be nitpicky, I will say that some of the custom sprite work doesn't feel faithful to the original game's art style. There is a clear difference between the shading on the Godzilla sprite and the custom enemies. But hey, it was 2011. It's not like I could do better. And as you get further into the story, the dissonance with the art style starts to add to the horror, selling how unnatural the final levels are. The premise is a bit familiar. Zack, our protagonist, gets a used copy of the NES title and excitedly rushes to play it. However, from the first boss fight, he starts to notice graphical glitches, new monsters, and altered levels. The story feels like a slow descent into hell, as the music and imagery goes from strange to off-putting to terrifying. Zack is undeterred, being excited to see what other changes the game has in store, thinking it might have been a prototype copy or ROM hack. That naivete is quickly dashed when he first meets Red. At the end of every world, this creature hunts after Zack in various forms, unrelenting and deadly. Red is the master of this game's world, something that becomes more and more apparent over time. The gradual tonal shift is one element that really makes the story, something it can afford by being so long. The way Zack describes a lot of the elements can make it fun at times to keep up with, as not every change is inherently scary. Even though the screen caps were drawn around the story, it does feel sometimes like the other way around, a blogger trying to explain the various things he encounters. There's even a decent amount of world building, as some creatures and settings reappear in later levels. A good amount of time is spent on this peaceful forest full of deer creatures that we later revisit in winter, with the cold too much for most of the forest's inhabitants. The carnivorous raptors start overwhelming the rest of the population before turning on each other. This isn't even part of the main story. We also see a lot of attention to detail in the new boss fights, even when it doesn't add to the horror. It makes the game feel more complete and believable, to the effect that the official Godzilla account posted this version by mistake. The main story starts to become more evident further in, As Zack's curiosity turns to bitter resolve, Red starts showing signs of sentience, at first dismissed as coincidence, but soon too obvious to be ignored. We learn of Zack's middle school girlfriend, Melissa, whose mental episodes often troubled her, eventually causing her to run into traffic in front of him. Red taunts him over Melissa's death, infuriating him but leaving him unable to look away, having to find what lies within. The art gets more detailed and horrific, as the difficulty turns the game from action to survival. Luckily, Zack puts his money where his mouth is, being pretty good and gaining some new monsters for his trouble. Still the best. Eventually, he comes across a blue figure, dubbed the Angel, who sacrifices herself to save him from Red. This encounter gives way to the nightmarish world of Zenith. That's the goriest and most brutal this game gets. At the end of Zenith, he comes face to face with Red, who devastates his troop of monsters. The finale remains contentious among the fanbase, as it's here where the supernatural begins to surpass the limits of the game. Zack is forced to remain sitting, and feels the pain each of his monsters feel, as Red taunts him that it was responsible for Melissa's death. He's powerless as Red defeats him, when suddenly, the Angel reappears, the spirit of Melissa, who gives him one last monster, capable of defeating Red and breaking the spell. Overwhelmed by emotion, he decides to sell the cartridge after beating Red, unable to destroy it, but too afraid to hold onto it. As stated, I tend to dislike the ghosts and demons explanation, and having such a happy and literal ending takes away some of the story's charm. The implication that Red had a hand in Melissa's death would have been better than outright saying it, as would Melissa's involvement in saving Zack. The more dialogue you give to your paranormal entities, the more it humanizes them, which I'm not as big a fan of. Still, impressive art and attention to detail, and easy to get invested in. One of the internet's most famous creepypastas is Abandoned by Disney, a flagship story for the corrupted kids media genre. It predates Five Nights at Freddy's by a year, so it gets kudos for being a trendsetter. Written in 2013 by Slimebeast, it went on to gain 2 sequels and a prequel. Slimebeast is a well-known creator, having a few other famous stories under his belt, but apparently a fair bit of drama as well. I don't care to go into that, so I'll just focus on the fiction. The original story is inspired by the real-life Treasure Island, an extension of Disney World that was abandoned and left to rot, though Disney still enforces it as private property. Several expeditions have been made over the years to document the state of the facility, a notable one in 2009 by Shane Perez. The first story discusses Mowgli's Palace, a Jungle Book attraction built in North Carolina, and subsequently closed and locked by Disney. Breaking in, the protagonist documents the site's state of disrepair, slowly reclaimed by nature, and yet left lived in. The TV still on, the food was left out. The words "abandoned by Disney" are scrawled throughout the building. Eventually, in the employee-only area, he finds a row of costumes, including a photo-negative Mickey suit. To his horror, the rotting suit stands up and speaks.
"Hey, wanna see my head come off? Huh?"
And true to its word, it rips its head off, with thick, coagulated blood seeping out. As the protagonist runs away, they see one last message: abandoned by God. Short, simple, and sweet. It's a pretty decent entry. But the immediate sequel and following prequel were what hooked me. I was torn on which to talk about, but Room Zero won out. The follow-up turns the camera to the narrator, who's been troubled ever since posting his original story. He knows he's being watched. Those following him haven't been entirely subtle, nor have they made any overt moves, just making him aware that Disney knows what he did. It brings to mind a lot of the unease from Franz Kafka's The Trial. Ordinary life goes on, but with the feeling that you're falling deeper and deeper into someone else's control. There's also an ambiguity in the calling cards Disney leaves, the hidden Mickeys. Some are clearly a message from the company, but Disney fans have been known to see the symbol where it's not there. Could the harassment start turning into paranoia? Publishing the original story inspired several individuals to reach out, and the rest of the story becomes an anthology of their strange tales. What I like about Room Zero is that it never reaches the same level of gore as the original, and the paranormal feels evenly mixed in with realism. For example, the utility corridors are very much a real thing, as is Club 33, the inspiration behind Club 22. Disney does attend to mascots having medical emergencies, though they do still try to work discreetly as to not break the illusion. Even the more outlandish bits, such as the titular Room Zero, don't feel entirely out of place. I could believe that Disney World had a bomb shelter during the Cold War, and even that Disney would have branded gas masks. As with Godzilla NES, attention to detail goes a long way. The time taken to describe the concrete room built above Room Zero, the bureaucratic red tape that keeps it hidden. It's good at building tension, and it doesn't even end with a bang. It supposedly explains the mystery of the gas cots, alluded to throughout the anthology. And yet, even if they are supposed to be the people trapped in Room Zero, they were sealed under layers of concrete years ago. Unlike the simple, "a ghost did it" explanation, it's this impossibility that makes one shudder. A good horror story should draw you in with a narrative that, if not believable, at least doesn't break the immersion. It lures you in, keeps you invested, but leaves you without the answers, so that the dark recesses of your mind can do the legwork. Which is why I hate the last entry in the series, Corruptus, where the previous entries kept this theme of separate incidents related to Disney. The finale explains it away as the power of imagination. It's people's fears and nightmares that are made manifest, belief making it real. Disney seeks to make dreams come true, and Corruptus implies they were all too successful, doing damage control ever since. This was done deliberately to allow other authors to write their own stories in the setting. But personally, I'd have preferred he left the originals as they were. Maybe, if I just believe it never happened, it'll get taken down. The stories we've discussed so far have all used incredible detail, gradual tension, and deliberate mystery to build a good horror plot. They haven't relied on jump scares, and the gore is always described rather than shown. Well, a bit of gore in Godzilla, but it's mostly pixels. Now, for this last story. Forget all of that. I wouldn't call Sonic.exe objectively good. At least, not the original, but it would be a disservice to my younger self to ignore it. The other stories I could handle while reading at night, if a bit shaken. But Sonic.exe terrified me like no other. I had to look away, cover my ears during that awful laugh. I would look up pictures of the end screen, that blood-soaked grin, and stare at it, to try to condition myself out of the fear. But it didn't work. When I first saw Sonic.exe, it was Markiplier's playthrough. I had no idea it was a fan game based off an existing written work. And when I found out, even I wasn't scared of the original. Released in 2011, Sonic.exe was written by Jack Cranley. Pretty standard haunted video game stuff. Tom receives a copy of Sonic with a warning from his friend Kyle, begging him to destroy it. He decides to play it instead, and witnesses a version of Sonic with black sclera and red pupils, hunting down the game's side characters, starting with Tails, then Knuckles, and finally Dr. Robotnik. The Phantom toys with them before swooping in for the kill. All the while, he mocks Tom, threatening him before shutting his computer off. As he sits, terrified of what he had witnessed and the implications for Kyle, he hears a voice behind him. "Try to keep this interesting for me, Tom," and turns to see a plushie with bloodstains under its eyes. Though not very well written, JC was pretty specific about the events on screen, as well as what music and sound effects were used where. With enough blueprints to work with, MY5T Crimson created a fan game to recreate the experience, though excising some of the names to avoid confusion. Released in 2013, It exploded in popularity, overshadowing the original story and developing a fandom. One of the most effective things about this game was the sound design. The original version I watched didn't have the voice acting, just reused music and sound effects as detailed in the creepypasta. But the timing, whether intentional or not, is what kept me on the edge of my seat. The increasingly loud static as you approached Sonic, that cuts out right as he notices you. The agonizing gaps of silence while you're waiting for him to show up. The long levels that surround you with this depressing, spine-tingling music as you search for your own demise. Several more versions were created that I'm not as familiar with, adding more to the original story. Sonic.exe became X, a being from another dimension who took the form of Sonic. The characters in-game became spirits, former players trapped by X and tormented for eternity. They even added a section where you can play as Sonic. But Sonic.exe has a tendency of outgrowing its creators, as fans make their own renditions that take on lives of their own. A good thing, too, because JC turned out to be a creep. Even back as a kid, I remember stuff like Sally.exe and Sunky.mpeg, but over the course of the 2010s, there have been remakes, sequels, and reimaginings galore. I didn't keep up with it, and nowadays, I'm not sure where to start. Like, is that a multiplayer game? When did Metal Sonic get here? Who the hell is Starved? I'm no expert, and it's hard to keep track of history here, but Friday Night Funkin' seems to be the source of a modern resurgence of Sonic.exe, namely, one massive mod, versus Sonic.exe. Rather than just being a well-drawn adaptation of the original game, it features many nightmarish versions of the Sonic mythos. They've got the evil Super Sonic from the Fleetway comics, the infamous Tails doll from Sonic R, Majin Sonic from the Sonic CD sound test, even characters from other Sonic creepypastas, like Fatal Error and Needle Mouse. Also, at least according to TV tropes, a ton of characters that were scrapped, for various reasons. To go on a bit of a detour here, I had no idea what Needle Mouse was when I found this mod, but I liked the redesign. Purple's a good color on him. To my surprise, I found a full-scale remake of Sonic.exe, an attempt to add drama, tragedy, and humanity to the characters. Now, usually mystery is what keeps me invested, but I found myself genuinely liking a more grounded, fleshed-out take over the campy original. The whole thing is finished and on YouTube, so if you're a fan of analog horror and/or Sonic.exe, I recommend giving it a watch. It follows the deaths of several men by a vengeful spirit, inhabiting a disc with the first 3 Sonic games. Rather than out of wanton cruelty, it's personal, something these men did that they must now atone for. Season 1 ends with the victims trapped forever under the watchful eye of Sonic. If the spirit can never leave, neither can they. However, as we learn more about the spirit within Sonic, and this story's versions of Tom and Kyle, Needle Mouse begins to grow into its own. Sonic is haunted by Sarah Henderson, a former friend of the victims who died in an accident. Her death covered up, her soul was never allowed to rest, and she has been hunting those responsible ever since. The forlorn spirit of Luther, inhabiting Tails, cannot stand idly by when she goes after his son, and so the story becomes a battle for survival. The animation is charming, and the redesigns give it a lot more personality. The dialogue and voice acting isn't the strongest, but for a YouTube analog horror series that's fanfiction of a Sonic creepypasta, I'm not going in with high standards. There were other creepypastas I enjoyed in my youth, and many more that I read out of sheer boredom, but these 4 stood out the most, immediately coming to mind when I sat down to write this script. Coming out at the dawn of the 2010s, they were trailblazers for internet indie horror. You can see their DNA in a lot of what's followed after. Derivative works, adaptations, references by the original companies, and even if I didn't find them quite as scary as an adult, it was fun to take an eerie stroll down memory lane. I hope you all have a happy Halloween, and feel free to share some of your favorite horror in the comments. Go, my ghouls! Eat candy, dress up, and scare the shit out of your neighbors, And most importantly, have fun.